Welcome to the Radical Lifestyle Podcast, brought to you by Generation to Generation, where you will be inspired by the past, equipped for the present, and prepared for the future as we engage in conversations with people from around the world. Okay, today I want to welcome Charlotte. She's she'll say a lot more about who she is in a minute, but she's one of our favorite people in Israel, lives in Jerusalem. I'll randomly message her from time to time just to see how she's doing, because she's probably one of the hardest working people that we know. So I'll message, say, hey, you doing okay? Getting some rest? The answer is normally no, but that's just the way it is. But yeah, Charlotte, do you want to just introduce yourself, who you are, where you come from, what you do for people that are listening?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I am Charlotte Korchak. I am originally from Los Angeles, California. That's where I was born and raised. But when I was 9 years old, my parents decided to move me and my 4 older siblings to Israel. So we moved here. We lived here for 5 years. And then we ended up moving back to the States as a result of a big wave of terrorism that struck Israel, making it kind of impossible to survive here economically. And so we moved back to the United States. I finished up high school there and then made my way out to university back in Los Angeles, actually, the University of Southern California. And it was there that I became active for Israel, where I started to, speak out on behalf of Israel when I encountered anti-Israel sentiment and saw that there was a need. That's how I found the organization that I now work for, StandWithUs, which is how we met. And I was a fellow for StandWithUs while I was on my college campus. So we have a fellowship program called the Emerson Fellowship. And I was in Emerson in the first year of the Emerson Fellowship back in 2007. And then after graduating from university, I managed to somehow get a job with this incredible organization. And I am now 10 years deep into the organization. I just celebrated my 10-year anniversary about a month ago. I started out working on college campuses in the Southwestern United States, specifically helping students with Israel activism on their campus, be it countering anti-Israel sentiment or events that were taking place, or helping them be proactive when it comes to bringing Israel to their campus and speaking out in a positive way about Israel. 2.5 years into doing that job, I decided I really wanted to move home, and I moved back to Israel 7.5 years ago now. And here in Israel, I am the senior educator and the director of international student programs for StandWithUs, which means that my major role is educating students from around the world. I work with students predominantly in high school, all the way up through young professionals. But really, over my years, I've really dabbled in every different community. And a big part of that is also traveling around the world, being able to speak to different communities around the world, which, allowed me to come visit y'all outside of Cambridge. And so I travel predominantly to the United States, Canada, and the UK at least twice a year. And then other destinations as well, South Africa, Australia, other places where usually Jewish communities or universities or institutions bring me in to, again, educate people about Israel, about the conflict, and help them better understand the reality on the ground here in Israel.
So when you go to colleges and universities, what sort of reception do you get? I mean, I presume it's to coin a phrase, pro-Israel people invite you in, but what sort of reception do you have?
So to be honest, I very rarely get a negative reception. I'll tell you that. Yes, it is true that usually the students who bring me in are either the Jewish Society or the pro-Israel students on campus, the Israel Society. And so usually it really just all depends on who shows up. But more often than not, we have Jewish students or pro-Israel students who are showing up to deepen their knowledge and their skills to be able to have a conversation with fellow students about the conflict. And then there's other times where other people will come who are not necessarily pro-Israel, but also not anti-Israel, just people who are curious, right? They have friends who are part of the Israel Society or part of the Jewish Society. And so they invite them. And, it's a curious topic for a lot of people. It's something that's mentioned a lot, but you don't really know a lot about it. And so usually I get a very warm reception. I think I joke that I kind of function under the radar a little bit. There's Israelis who come to campus who, were former Israeli soldiers or Israeli diplomats, and they get, protested. We don't want Israelis on our campus. We don't want soldiers on our campus, which is ridiculous. I mean, again, freedom of speech, everyone should be able to speak. And they get shouted down and, protested. That almost never happens to me. I've never dealt with a walkout of any kind. or any kind of real protest. Actually, the first time that one of my events in the UK was meant to be protested was just recently. I was supposed to be at the University of Nottingham, and it ended up randomly snowing that day in Nottingham. And so they just, like, no one wanted to show up. But even at that event, it ended up being a small group because, of course, it snowed. It was probably 15 people. But out of it, a solid handful, 5 students, were not pro-Israel, had nothing to really do with Israel. They were just curious. And so they showed up. And so that's my favorite audience. I'm not looking for the chaos. I'm not looking for people to come out and protest. I'm really looking for the people who want to grow and deepen their knowledge and understanding of the conflict. I think the other thing that I've also experienced is people show up maybe wanting to argue, expecting that I'm going to come in and be the kind of the very classic, like, right-wing Israel can do no wrong type speaker. And then once they've heard me speak, they almost are disarmed, because I'm not a speaker who just sees Israel through rose-colored glasses and thinks everything's perfect. And I also have spent time, in Palestinian homes, and I have an immense amount of sympathy for what they're going through. And I express that when I speak about the conflict. It's not black or white. It's not zero sum. It's not that one side is right and one side is wrong. There are people suffering on both sides of this conflict. And I think when you come in and present from that very middle place of, I have sympathy for Israel and I'm pro-Israel, but I can also call Israel out when they've made a mistake or done something really wrong. And I'm going to do the same thing when it comes to the Palestinians. And I think that really tends to disarm people who might show up to an event wanting to come in and be combative and argue. And then they end up maybe just asking, a question that's really polite and not hostile, just to kind of elaborate maybe on Palestinian suffering or on what's going on when it comes to the Palestinians.
One of the things that impressed us when we came very, very early on, when we still were going, what is this Stand With Us? All we knew, it was a big blue sign as we walked down the road. And while we were there, there was a talk. I'm not sure if it was you or Chevy. Chevy at the time. And she said, well, do you want to come and listen to what's happening? We said, sure. And it was a Palestinian who was actually speaking to them. Yeah. And we went, well, they are not afraid. They're not afraid to hear the other side. They're secure in who they are.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even, I tend to say to a lot of Israel activists, because to be honest, in my job, the people who I encounter most are already people who are pro-Israel, but lack, the knowledge and the tools to be able to really have an effective and productive conversation about Israel. And I tend to always say to them, on either side, wherever you stand, if you feel like you have to hide information to defend your argument, then there's something wrong with your argument. You know what I mean? And like, that's just, I guess I'm a historian, and I was always taught to look at things from all different angles and try to remove your bias. And I always say, if you're afraid of transparency, then we have a problem. Yeah. If you're afraid of somebody talking about something that's wrong with Israel, then we have a problem. Now, that being said, I think there is something to discuss here, which is, where to have those conversations, because we can't forget that we're not just a country that has a bad reputation, and therefore we have people out in the world who are there to repair the bad reputation of Israel. That's not, we're not a country like Colombia, right? It has a bad reputation. People, when you think of Colombia, you think of drugs, you think of murder, right? I mean, I grew up in the 90s and it was the murder capital of the world. That's what I knew of Colombia. But that was simply because of their circumstances, right? So in Israel, we have a bad reputation because, yes, the average person, when they think of Israel, they usually think of war and violence, because that's just when they hear of Israel, usually in the news, that's what they hear. But we have another force out there as well that we have to acknowledge, which is an anti-Israel force that is daily working to delegitimize Israel. And so with them, it's when Israel does anything that's wrong or that could be construed as wrong, they, grab onto it and say, look. And then when an Israeli or someone who's pro-Israel comes in and says, look, this is something that Israel did that was wrong, they say, look, even the Jew is acknowledging how bad Israel is. And so I always say, in my classroom, you said it, in our education center here in Jerusalem, I have no fear to bring in a Palestinian to be open and tell their story and talk about their experiences and expose my students to that. Would I encourage that to happen on a college campus without proper framing. I don't know. Again, it's you have to really make sure and be careful, because unfortunately, again, any criticism of Israel is oftentimes turned around and used against us. So I say in my classroom, we could be as critical, we could be completely transparent, we could talk about everything. When you step outside and you're facing, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, you have to be very careful about where and when we have those critical conversations. Because in my classroom, we're doing it because, one, we want to know more, we care about Israel, and we want Israel to be the best country that it could be. Once you step outside, you will find people who want to hear criticism of Israel not to be constructively critical to make Israel better, but to use it to help delegitimize and ultimately destroy Israel. And the last thing we want to do is give them more fodder for their activity.
We often find people who we appreciate their enthusiasm for wanting to support Israel, but they see Israel through those rosy glasses, and they are not able to see the points of Israel which should be called out. And if you were not able to call out those points in Israel, and others who are very anti-Israel notice that, it then takes the legs out of the legitimate points that you have to say. I remember as well, we the year, I'm sure, but when was the flotilla ship situation?
2010. No, 2010. May 2010.
So I remember that happening. And
by the way, the only reason that I remember that is because it was exactly a month after I started working for Stand With Us, and it happened to be Memorial Day weekend. So it was literally exactly 10 years ago, almost to the day.
No, Charlotte, you remember everything.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm a freak about dates, but with that one in particular, it was like, I'll never forget, like the CEO of Stand With Us, like waking me up Memorial Day morning saying, this happened, we have to send out a newsletter. And I had like just learned how to do a newsletter, and we were still doing newsletters in code. And so I was like trying to figure it out while I have the CEO like barking at me, obviously like trying to get this out, and not barking at me in a negative. I love Roz Rothstein, who founded this organization, but there was a sense of urgency, and I was like, oh God, I don't know what I'm doing. So I have a very, very distinct memory of the flotilla, just from the PR standpoint of what we had to do in such an urgency to get out information, because unfortunately the Israeli government wasn't doing a good job at getting out information. Anyway, sorry, tangent. Go ahead.
You're good. If I have a question about a date regarding Israel, I don't bother with Google. I just go to Charlotte for her internal Google system. Let you tell me. But when that happened, I remember things being said in the media, and I was like, that's not correct. That is definitely not true. And I had a friend at the time, and I won't say who it is, but she's within US intelligence, and her remit was the Middle East, especially focusing on Israel. And so I'd message her and say, hey, look, this is what's been said. This is what I think's going on. Can you may not be able to give me details, but just tell me, am I heading in the right ballpark, or that kind of stuff? And she'll reply and say this, that, and the other. And actually, I got sent footage of what was going on, and it completely disproved everything that at the time I was hearing in the media. So I posted about it on social media, and it went off. I mean, I was called various names under the sun, all that good stuff. And I ended up having friends who were supportive of Israel, messaging me saying, hey, I want to chime in. I want to jump in on this thread. Are you okay if I do that? And I said to them, look, if you know enough information to communicate what you're feeling, dive in, have at it. But if you don't, you just know you're correct, but you don't have the information to back it up, I said, stay out of it, because even if the other side's wrong and they throw more information in, they'll make you look really silly, and it won't help the situation. So, you're saying about pick your battles. Like you may know you're right, but if you don't have the information to back it up, just let someone else weigh in instead.
But that's what most people don't know, where to go for the information.
Right.
I mean, you said you knew someone here, and we know someone here, and that's where I think Stand With Us is such a good place. I mean, when we take people out there, we take tours or people we know, they say, well, where can we find the truth? And we always say, sign up for Stand With Us, listen to what they're saying. It is knowing where to hear the truth.
Yeah. That I think is by far the biggest challenge. This conflict is so complex, and I think today, especially young people, they really want simplicity. They just want things to be black and white. They want it to be easy, And so there's such an effort to try to simplify the conflict. And when you simplify something, you make it this kind of easy dynamic of like, there's a good guy and there's a bad guy. And that makes my life easy because then I can very easily position myself on the side of the good guy. And then it's kind of like, but no, like life is first of all not black and white, but this conflict in particular is there's so many layers and there's so much to be learned. And so when you're having a back and forth, I think a lot of people also think like, well, I'm going to counter this and this person's against me and therefore I can't agree with anything that they say, not realizing that actually in a conversation what you could do is find a lot of common ground in terms of the facts. And then really it's just a matter of what we disagree on the conclusion based on our different values. But unfortunately, most people just don't have that information. So Stand With Us, that's our primary goal. That's my primary goal. I always tell people during my lectures, I literally give out my cell phone number in lectures to say to people, you don't have a resource, now you do. And I don't say it lightly and it's not an empty, offer. I always say, you have my phone number. If you get asked a question or if something comes up and you need clarification, just ask. I will happily send you information to clarify. And very rarely do people take me up on this, but I've had a few students. One really comes to mind, one of these students that I have in Arizona who actually joined the Stand With Us Emerson Fellowship after we had met. And she messages me on a consistent basis because she is on campus and she's facing Palestinian rhetoric, anti-Israel rhetoric, I should say, on Twitter and on their posts on different social media platforms. And so she comes to me and she says, this is what they're saying. How do I combat it? And that's what I'm here to do, And so even if people, and then Stand With Us as an organization, when something comes up, we're there to try to put out as much information as we can. So when, the Trump Peace to Prosperity plan came out in the beginning of this year, Stand With Us immediately put out a fact sheet on the peace plan, along with a context of all the other peace plans that had come before it. And that's available on our website. So if anyone didn't want to read the 180-page plan, and I didn't even read the 180-page plan. You think I have time to do that? No, I have a research team, and that's what they're there for. They read everything, and then they sum it up for all of us so that we can be knowledgeable, but not have to read 180 pages of a document, right? Mm-hmm. Just recently, right, there's this whole talk now about annexation or the application of sovereignty, however you would prefer to refer to what Israel is considering doing in parts of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. And so Stand With Us just recently put out, again, a fact sheet on kind of the pros and cons. What does it mean, the application of sovereignty or annexation? What would the implications be? Why are people against it? Why are people for it? And I think what I love most about Stand With Us and why I can so solidly stand up and speak out on behalf of this organization is that we're not here to preach to you a specific perspective. And that's my favorite part about what I do is I'm not here to make you believe one side or the other. I want to show you as many different perspectives as possible. And I want to be part of the process of you forming an opinion. I don't want to be the one to give you an opinion. Mm. And I think the key there is taking a step back. I think what I've learned most as someone who kind of sits in the middle is how much, each side thinks that they're right. And I kind of have such an issue with people thinking that opinions are right. No, it's your opinion. It's right for you. It might not be right for me. And that goes back to who we are as people and the fact that, you have your values and I have my values, and those are formed over, our lifetimes and the experiences that we've gone through. And for somebody to look at me and say, well, you should think like me, which means your values should be my values, is a little bit narcissistic. And not being able to kind of say, there can be someone who sits completely across the aisle from me, and I can have full respect for them and full respect for their opinion, even though I completely disagree with it. And that is, civil discourse and civil dialogue and what we need in the world. And unfortunately, less and less of that is happening, especially due to social media, where people are really, you see somebody post something that you don't like and you just block them. And you've created this echo chamber where you just keep, your own opinions just keep reverberating and you never get to hear a dissenting opinion. And that's an incredibly dangerous prospect for the world. Yeah. And so what we, I think, try to do most is just encourage dialogue. Just keep talking about it. It's a never-ending conversation where you can continue to develop your knowledge and your understanding of what's going on here. And that, I think, is the key and what Stand With Us really tries to encourage more than anything else.
I found that certainly there was a lot of fear, particularly in Israel, about hearing the other side. It was really useful to us when we came in to Stand With Us, and this whole perspective of being able to hear the other side, that they've got a narrative, and it actually really propelled us forward, because we took some young people from 9 nations out there, and when
for those listening, this is how we actually connected with Stand With Us.
Yeah.
Carry on.
So and we said to some people, we're
Can
going
we just plug it? Sorry, I'm going to plug it for you guys. The Quest for Truth documentary. Everyone should be watching it. It's a fantastic, fantastic film, and so well done and so fascinating. So I'm going to plug it because you're not plugging it. So everyone should really just log on and watch this documentary, and the amount of effort that you all put into it, just out of a whim. You'd never made a movie before, you'd never made a documentary, and you guys just kind of decided to do this. And I'm so happy that Stand With Us was able to be a part of it. Sorry, now you can.
We couldn't have done it without you, Charlotte. We couldn't. Walking past that office door was one of the best moves in the whole thing.
It was funny that, because remember where you were going with it, but when we first got there, we didn't know what Stand With Us was. And I remember pressing the buzzer on the door, because you have to be let in through the lock. And people looking at me, whoever was on reception, just looking at me, giving me a sort of awkward eye. Like, who the heck is this guy? I guess with the big beard, for those that are listening.
You didn't have a big beard at the time, though. You didn't.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't this much.
Way later.
Yeah, that's true. And I think eventually there was like 5 people gathered around looking at me through the door. And they were like, who are you here to see? No one in particular. What about? Well, we don't really know at this point. It's like I was just trying to be awkward.
Are you trying to come in and kill us? Because that's what we're thinking. Of course, that's why we have to have security, unfortunately.
But because of this whole perspective that you're talking about hearing the other side, I think we stayed in the Palestinian territory.
In Bethlehem. Didn't your hotel have swastikas like carved into the?
Yes,
they did. And when we saw,
I'm smiling and laughing while I said that. It's not cool at all.
No.
I remember that distinctly though, when you guys came out of Bethlehem and the kids, the teens were like, let me show you a picture of the column outside of our hotel. I was like, wow.
And it's interesting because it was the German youngsters that saw it.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones that noticed it. But we had people actually saying to us, don't take them there. You shouldn't do it. You will lose them. Whatever lose them meant, they will end up, and I hate these words, I hate pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel, because we're talking about people.
Yes.
We're talking about people. But
and to be pro-Israel doesn't mean that you're anti-Palestinian.
No.
To be pro-Palestinian doesn't mean that you're anti-Israel.
There was a lot.
And that's really, again, that zero sum that's been created that is so damaging. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
It seems to be the default people have. If you're pro one side, that means you have to be anti the other side.
But if we hadn't had, I think, the encouragement from Stand With Us and this whole perspective of listening to the other side, it might have caused us to waver, because we didn't want to influence these youngsters.
Wow.
They were going to go there. But in actual fact, the end result of them listening after they had processed what they'd heard, and although they became more aware of facts than feelings, was that it left them with a compassion for both people. Now, that doesn't mean that you agree with everything people say or agree with what's happening, but they did end up with a compassion for both sides, and that was a very healthy thing. So thank you for the encouragement to take them there and leave them there and let them loose there.
I mean, of course, I in my mind, it's like, of course, but I do understand the fear. I do just want to, give a little bit support to those people, because I think, okay, so we've experienced this, and so you guys can kind of back up what I'm about to say, because it's intense. But I've sat, with Palestinian Authority officials. I've sat with PLO officials, and unfortunately, what I see as a historian and someone who really prides myself on facts and not feelings, is they play really fast and loose with facts. They play fast and loose with the truth. And so there is a fear amongst Israelis that if you take people to, sit down with Palestinians, that they're just going to tell them a lot of either misinformation or things that are wildly taken out of context. And that because of the emotion, because of how compelling the narrative is, that they could so easily become anti-Israel.
Yeah.
And I think what we try to do as an organization is to alleviate that fear, to say, first of all, you don't just unleash them. There is a framing that takes place, and there are debriefs that take place. And so you don't just kind of like send them to speak to a Palestinian and then like never talk to them about it again. They come back and then, you know, they would say, you know, well, he said X, Y, and Z. Is that true or not true? Or is there more to it than that? And so by allowing that proper framing, and what Stand With Us does very often is we kind of try to act as that middle ground, just the fact place. So we'll take our groups to Palestinians. We'll take them, you know, to go hear from Israeli settlers who live in the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. And then at the end of every session, we kind of pull them back in and say, okay, let's do some fact checking, you know. And again, I think people grow to trust us as kind of a fact checking organization. And we'll always say, like, here are the sources, you can look it up yourself. And so I think that's where you alleviate the fear. I think their fear is valid. There are people who are brought here, taken directly into the territories. It's not framed properly. It's also, and they won't show you the Israeli side. And so you get very much almost brainwashed to just see, it's not just compassion for the Palestinians, it's compassion for the Palestinians and a hatred of Israel for doing this to the Palestinians, without fully understanding that Israel isn't just doing this to the Palestinians because we're an oppressor and we're just oppressing people, which is, again, that zero sum and how people try to frame it. But they ignore the incredible context of, you know, Israel is trying to protect itself. You can't leave that part out of the story. And that's often what will happen is, you know, from a Palestinian, in the amount of times that I've spent with Palestinians, I don't think I've ever heard a Palestinian say the word terrorism. Right? The same way that it's very rare to hear Jews outside of Israel, for example, use the term occupation. I always joke that these are both of our blind spots. I don't joke, it's true. For them, they have a blind spot. They don't see terrorism. They see it as legitimate resistance. And for Israelis, we don't see it as occupation. We see it as legitimate security. Meanwhile, once you kind of break those two things apart, you realize that terrorism and occupation, what we're really talking about is humans. We're talking about the fact that how terrorism and occupation impacts the human being. And removing the justifications, you can still then have compassion for Israelis suffering under terrorism and Palestinians suffering under occupation, still being able to acknowledge that full picture. And really the I'm going to say catch 67 rather than catch 22 that we find ourselves in, because post 67, and I'm stealing that from Micha Goodman, who wrote a book called Catch 67 in the last few years, which is a brilliant he speaks about the aftermath of 1967 and that war when Israel gained control over these territories where Palestinians were living. And really the challenge that we find ourselves in today, which is, you know, there's still terrorism, so Israel still has a need to protect itself. And yet through that protection, there is an occupation of a people who are suffering under that control. And so it's kind of this issue of, okay, well, we don't want to be doing that, but if we were to withdraw, then we're going to be facing a way bigger security threat. And also potentially the Palestinians could find themselves in a worse situation, i.e. what happened in Gaza back in 2005 when Israel withdrew and Hamas, a terrorist organization, took over and Palestinians found themselves in a much worse position. And so that we really find ourselves in a catch 67. And yet you still have people on both sides screaming like, but our solution is the right solution. And on both sides, this lack of being able to see compassion for the other side. And so they're really only focused on their people. And once you really open it up, you realize how big the catch actually is and how there isn't really a good solution in sight.
Yeah.
And so the only thing that we could have now is compassion for both sides. And the fact that we're both stuck in this conflict and we're both suffering as a result. And I have to say more Palestinians than Israelis today, just simply because of our governments and you know, one being significantly more corrupt and non-democratic than the other. And so there's a lot there, but if you could develop compassion for both sides, all of a sudden your opinion, it's never going to be static on one side or the other. It can't be. And that allows you to then really enter into the incredible complexity of this conflict where you will find yourself kind of pushed to the middle. And that's what we try to do a lot at Stand With Us is expose people so that they can feel those feelings and then work with them.
A good, very specific example of what you're talking about as well would be the security barrier, where when we met with Danny Terza, the guy who is the architect for that whole security barrier, we talked to him and, you know, from the outside, it's seen as just this evil thing which has been put there to either take land or, whatever it might be.
Well, from the inside also, right? I'm going to stress, right? Because you talked to Danny Tirza in Jerusalem, but then you went to Bethlehem, right? And we heard, and you all heard from somebody else, I would say on the inside, seeing it the same way as people do outside, meaning outside in the world, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add that.
One of the things I appreciate about Danny is that while this isn't an evil, but the wall is like a necessary evil. It's a necessary negative. And so his heart is, we needed it for security. People were getting killed, bombs, all this kind of stuff. We need it, but I don't like this. And says that I would like to be the first one when we can to remove this brick. And so this is one of those situations where he doesn't like it. The man who had to design this whole thing, Palestinians in their territory don't like it. People in Israel, they probably don't like it. But at the minute, it's just this necessary negative that we can have a compassion because this is there for various reasons. And so it's a very specific example, I guess, of what you're just talking about.
Exactly. No, that's exactly the situation. Is I think more and more Israelis sit in like this middle place of, I don't want to continue to occupy other people. That's just not that's not who we are. That's not, part of what we wanted to do here. And then at the same time, they're like, but if we don't, what is going to be our reality? And there is, unfortunately, the Gaza withdrawal really left an indelible mark on a lot of Israelis. Because, for those who were so supportive of it, just so people have some context, back in 2005, Israel decided to withdraw about 8,500 settlers who had been living in the Gaza Strip. And they removed all basically Israelis, Jews from the Gaza Strip and moved them into Israel proper. And there was a huge debate inside of Israel. But a lot of people supported this. The left supported this because post-1967, the left's perspective was the way that we are going to solve this conflict is through land for peace. That if we give up territory, we will get peace from the other side. And look, they had a huge success, right? In 1979, they made peace with Egypt and it worked. We withdrew from territory and we have had peace with Egypt ever since. So they had this like moment of success. And then we had the Oslo Accords, which didn't really work. But then kind of 2005 was like this last ditch effort to try to, land for peace. Let's show the Palestinians we're willing to withdraw. And it was devastation for the left because they had this vision that if we withdrew, the Palestinians, would pick themselves up by their bootstraps and take this territory and make it into, the Singapore of the Middle East is what people were calling it at the time, because could be this gorgeous territory on the Mediterranean. Instead, Hamas takes over violently and they've turned it into basically Hamastan. They've turned it into a terrorist cell. And not only has Israel experienced more violence, but the Palestinians themselves living in Gaza are now suffering under the thumb of Hamas, an organization that is dedicated to spending way more of their funding and spending it on terror than on infrastructure. And so the Gaza Strip's falling apart. And so again, we're sitting here in Israel saying, okay, now let's look to the West Bank, where there's an additional 500,000 people. There's 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank, around that. And what would happen if we were to withdraw? And not only would Hamas take over and we could get more violence towards Israel, but also for the Palestinians living there. And would that be better than living under currently the conditions of, partial Israeli control and partial Palestinian Authority Fatah control? And so it really is this struggle of I want the security, but I don't want this to be my reality. I don't want walls separating me and the Palestinians. I don't want a security fence between, and again, I don't ever want it to be framed as us and them. And that's what we've done. And so it's sad. It's really, really sad. It's one of, again, we find ourselves in this moment of, we want to be safe. We also don't want to be, and the only way that we've found that we can is through this control in the West Bank. And so it's again, this book has really just been on my mind because the whole thing is just, there's no good answer. Everyone's right and everyone's wrong. And it's like, there's no good way moving forward unless we change the dynamic entirely. And I think that's what he's pushing for, or what he speaks about, which is not solving the conflict, but minimizing the conflict and managing the conflict in a different way, has become way more, I think, of what Israelis are now kind of like realizing is going to be our future. Of the notion of a final agreement in the near future is just not realistic in any way, shape, or form. But maybe we could achieve partial agreements that would, lessen the violence and allow for more cooperation. And eventually, maybe in a different generation, a final peaceful resolution.
Just quickly, how long do you need to go?
I'm good.
Oh, you're good.
Okay. Changing tack slightly. What's the current situation with Bibi Netanyahu? With the trial which is going on? What do you know of what's happening? How do you see this thing sort of playing out?
Okay, in my limited knowledge, but I think my limited knowledge tends to be more than the average person.
Right.
But my limited knowledge, Bibi, let's see. So Bibi was indicted on 3 different cases. 2 of them are for basically it's kind of like fraud. It's for paying or giving favors for good press. That's two of the cases. And then another one is a fraud case dealing with an Israeli communications company. So his trial started at the beginning of this week. And it's going to take a while probably, so we don't really know what's going to happen. I think what's important is understand the context. So we just swore in our government as well. There's big controversy in Israel about our government. Let's just put that out there. We basically created an emergency government because of Corona. We had 3 different elections. And I think if the pandemic hadn't happened, we probably would be going into a 3rd round of elections right now. Or excuse me, a 4th round of elections. They ended up forming a government in a really kind of weird way where like the party that was going after Bibi Netanyahu and kind of trying to get him out of office, the head of that party split that party. And some of the members of that party have now signed on to a coalition with Bibi Netanyahu, which is what allowed him to basically get a government, get a coalition that now has been sworn in. To get that agreement, though, he had to agree that his premiership would only be 18 months and that next November 2021, I think it's November, October, I think it's November, that his rival, who now joined his coalition, the head of that counter party, Benny Gantz is who I'm talking about, is then going to take over the premiership. So he did have to commit to a limited time as the prime minister. And to be honest, from what I've read, the cases that have now begun, it could take until next November for us to actually, and when I say next November, I'm talking 2021, for us to actually have an answer on Bibi's indictments and whether or not he's going to be charged and what would be the punishment. I will say that most people believe that the Attorney General has enough evidence to convict him, because many believe that they wouldn't have gone this far had they not had enough evidence. And they've gotten very high up officials in Bibi's former governments to turn on him and to testify against him. I actually know one of them personally. His family and my family have been really good friends since back when my father and his father all lived in Los Angeles together. Anyway, so we're not really sure what's going to happen, but he will stay prime minister throughout the trial. I mean, there's no talk of that changing. So we do see a premiership of Bibi Netanyahu at least for again another year and a half. At that point, Benny Gantz would take over, and that's probably when we'll start to see really the whole trial kind of play out. But again, it's so hard to predict how long it's going to take and everything else. It is 3 cases. I will tell you, though, Bibi asked to be excused from a lot of the hearings, that like he doesn't have to show up in court so that he can continue to, govern the country. And the High Court has allowed that. So he appeared in the first day, but he'll appear sporadically over the next, forever, however long the trial takes. So, and then there's another thing to mention. I mean, and I'm bringing this up just because, inside of Israel, there's a lot of anxiety about the government. And, we've been a democracy from, the moment that this country was born. Everyone votes, but there's never been such polarization. And we've never had such a hard time creating a government. And then our government went too far this time. We have a cabinet, just like every other country has a cabinet. Unfortunately, our cabinet is used basically as to bribe people. I'm just going to throw that out there. Basically, to get coalitions created, you bribe people with ministerial positions. And going in, we have now sworn in, I believe the number is 36 ministers. This is double what we've had in the past. When Ben-Gurion started in 1949, the first government, he had 12 ministers. And why that's so concerning is a few of these ministers don't even have portfolios. Some of them have ridiculous portfolios, like random things that they're overseeing, which was just a joke. They were just created as political fodder. And that, for a lot of Israelis, has been something that has really ticked us off, because it also means more money, because every one of these people gets a pay boost if you're a minister. And on top of everything, our government, who hasn't been sitting in the government for a year and a half during all of this, and with the pandemic looming, decided to vote on giving all of themselves a pay raise. While the rest of the citizens, and they already get paid a ridiculous amount of money. And so there's a lot going on politically in Israel that is where a lot of the focus of Israelis is. And our focus isn't really on the Palestinians. It's not really on the conflict. It's on these domestic political, and some people would call it a political crisis that we find ourselves in. And so that's, with all of that, you talk just about Bibi's indictments, but it's Bibi's indictments, it's the elections, it's the attempt to build this coalition, and then all these ministerial positions. And it almost just feels like the government is getting more and more corrupt as time goes on, and Israelis are just sick of it. And that's really why during the pandemic, we've been out protesting. Social distancing, by the way, they've literally, in Rabin Square in Tel Aviv, they knew that people wanted to protest. So the government actually went out and put stickers on the floor for where everyone should stand while they protest, so that they're all proper social distancing. So it's like amazing, because at the same time, you also see like how much we are really a democracy. And even though we're super angry at the government, the municipality in Tel Aviv will ensure that your democratic voice will be heard. And if you want to go out and protest, this pandemic will not prevent that from happening. And I don't want anyone to think this is like the United States, where people are out protesting. They're protesting lockdowns and other things. We're actually protesting a real issue within our democratic system. And we're also doing it properly, social distancing, wearing masks, and doing what we need to do to protect our citizens while they're able to take an active role in our democratic system. So there's a lot going on. We're definitely in challenging times, but I also very adamantly need to say that no one should be out there saying that Israeli democracy is somehow going to completely fall apart, that somehow this country, that our system of government is going to change. There's nothing like that on the horizon. I will say, though, sorry, this just came to mind and I have to mention it. I know I give the longest answers, but the election cycle also brought out a lot of nastiness within people who were running. A lot of negative and really racist comments were made towards Arabs in the country who have voted in every one of our elections and have been active members of our democracy. And for them to all of a sudden be referred to as, fifth column within the country and things like that. So unfortunately, as we all know, again, I'm an American, elections bring out kind of the worst sometimes in people. And we really saw that in Israel. So the one thing that I will say is I'm super glad that we actually have a government now and we're out of campaigning and out of that electoral process, because it just brought out the worst in people. And I'm really hoping that kind of we can bounce back from that and get back to where we were before, just because it brought up things and it made me realize how much work there is to do within Israeli society as well. And I'll end with this, that people need to stop confusing the work that we need to do within Israel with the Palestinian conflict. And they need to stop airing our dirty laundry outside as if that has anything to do with what's going on with the Palestinians. There needs to be a separation. These are our domestic issues. I don't sit there and judge the UK for what's going on and have an opinion on Brexit. What do I know? I'm not a British citizen. People also shouldn't be putting their nose into our domestic issues and trying to, use them to then delegitimize Israel abroad. Yeah. You know what I mean? And that happens a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that, the things you've mentioned are, while it may be not great situation to be in, it does show democracy at work. They're not trying to stifle protests, they're actually trying to help enable them to happen, but in a safe way. Even Bibi's trial, guilty or not, again, it's showing, hey, look, we are willing to hold leaders accountable for their actions. And this whole polarization thing, again, this isn't just something about Israel for people listening. You've got England, America, over elections, over Brexit, whatever it is. This polarization is so extreme right now. It's a very concerning and unhealthy situation where you have parties, people from various extremes, apparently unable to have dialogues in a healthy way. So hopefully we can work our way through that sooner rather than later, so we can all start talking to each other again.
But I think we've also had successes, you know, like, yes, that's been the climate around the world, right? And we had, you know, in a lot of countries, the emergence of like really hyper nationalist right-wing parties. But we saw in Germany and France, they were defeated. Like they're not successful. And then we also, from the opposite side, you know, in the UK, again, I don't often chime in on UK politics, but in the last election, it was very challenging as a Jewish person to not chime in on UK elections. And as somebody who visits the UK so often, you know, I got to tell you, and by the way, not just the UK, but I travel around the world to Jewish communities. And to be honest with you, in the 10 years that I've been doing this, I've never encountered a Jewish community in experiencing such fear and anxiety due to a pending election. And I get that this was a huge controversy in the UK. I don't think it needed to be. The reality is that Jeremy Corbyn made himself out to be an anti-Semite. And it was, anyone could say, okay, I liked other policies of his, but if somebody's an anti-Semite, the reality is that is part of your character, and nobody like that should ever be leading a country. And so it was the height of anxiety and the height of fear. I mean, I had a Jewish student telling me that they were crying themselves to sleep, and all they could hear was their grandmother telling them the stories of what it was like in Austria, you know, in the late 1930s. And that to me, like, just was a moment of, wow, are we really there? And so it was such an amazing victory. You know, I'm not talking from conservative or labor. I'm not talking about whether or not, it doesn't matter to me where you stand politically. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about a really nasty human potentially being a leader of a very important country in the world. Yeah. And so it didn't matter. And so many Jews in the UK who never in their right mind would ever vote conservative had to go to the polling stations and plug their nose and vote for somebody simply out of immense fear of what the alternative was.
But it was tangible.
A great success where he was defeated, and dramatically defeated. And I think that was a resounding moment where, yes, I think people didn't vote for him for other reasons, but I also think anti-Semitism played a big role in his loss. Yeah. And so as much as there's been a shift politically in a lot of these spaces, we've also seen a lot of these systems overcome. Yeah. And I think Israel is going to overcome. It's just, and you see that's how we function. And so we'll get through it. It's not going to be easy. It's the people battling with their government at this point. But we'll get through it, and it's not going to end with violence or a revolution. We'll do it through a democratic system, because that's how we've always done it.
I think this is a good segue to the last question. Talking about what's happening in different countries and alluding to the struggles in England and the concerns within the Jewish communities, what are maybe a few points that people listening can say, hey, look, I can go away and do this to help support Israel or support the Jewish community, especially with the rise of anti-Semitism, things which are happening around the world. So what are a few points that people can go away and act on in order to help support?
Okay, so a few things. One, we spoke about this in the beginning, and it's kind of been a theme throughout. You know, the best way that you could help would be to be able to speak out against things that are happening, right? That requires, first and foremost, though, education. Right. So if you're really passionate, you got to do your due diligence of getting, again, it doesn't have to be the most in-depth, you don't have to be the walking encyclopedia, but you know, the basics on how we frame the conflict, how we talk about the conflict, and then have those resources like Stand With Us to, if somebody does get into the complexity, that you have somebody to turn to who can help you understand that better. So that's one, is just educate yourself, because the more educated you are, the more, when you find yourself in a situation where somebody is saying something anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, it will be so much easier for you to have the confidence to speak up and speak out and say, you know what, there's more. Daphne, do you want to say something?
I'll say one thing about that has deeply challenged me and really alarms me at the same time, that being silent is not supportive.
Yes.
In fact, there's a statement by someone or another that actually says that silence always supports the abuser. Always. And so this feeling of being quiet, I mean, we know the statement silent no more that comes out around Holocaust Memorial Day and everything. I usually keep saying to people, silence, that means an action. If you're not going to be silent, you're going to act. And there are ways to act, many ways to act. You can write to your senator, you can write to your member of parliament, you can write to the government. I think I heard that one email is received as about 200 voices. You know, they will take it as representing that. And I think it's a way to find out the truth too. And there was a big sign put up in London on a billboard outside a bus station. It was big, 6 foot high, and it was very anti-Semitic. And people were going online saying, this is terrible, this is terrible. And with my value system, I looked and I saw who put the billboards up, and I wrote to them. And I said, what about this? You know, that incident. And they wrote back and said, yes, we're aware of it. This was vandalism. We didn't put it up and we have taken it down. So if you act, you're also finding the truth. But I'm passionate about, if you're going to complain, if you're going to moan, then you need to take an action. Sorry to chip in there, but I'm very...
No, it's so important. I say that all the time about democracy. You know, I say that always to my friends in the US where they're complaining about who's in the government. And I'm like, you know, you're not allowed to complain if you don't vote. Like,
exactly.
You know, on the most basic level, the easiest thing you can do is vote. There's so much more that you can do. But on the most basic level, let your voice be heard. And that's, in a democracy, that's like one of the greatest things that you have. So absolutely. And I mean, for me, when you say silence is not support, to me, I think of, you know, I'm always going to go back as a Jew to the Holocaust, right? There were so many people who sat silently. Yeah. And this wasn't just silence that this was silence that led to people dying. Do you know what I mean? And so inaction is not support in any way, shape, or form. And we as Jews don't look at the many bystanders of Europe and say, oh, you guys were supportive of us because you didn't participate, because you weren't a perpetrator. No, but you basically allowed the perpetrators to do what they're doing. So yeah, no, you got to speak up. You got to speak out. So one, you got to have the knowledge to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing really when it comes to anti-Semitism is we got to call it out where it is. And we need to make sure that we have a proper definition for what it is and a proper understanding for what it is. So I'm a big believer in also teaching tolerance and teaching understanding of these different forms of hatred, and then calling them out when they happen. And I want to say to what you said, you know, where people were posting this photo of this billboard saying, look at this is outrageous. You then took the next step. But I got to say that their action was an action because it got you to then see it and then you to take that next step and make that phone call. So we're all part of the process. And for some of us, we might not have the time to do what you did, but we do have the time to at least take a picture, post it, and say, this is outrageous, and I want to raise awareness to this because this isn't okay. So raising awareness is a step. And then for those of us who are more invested, who, you know, spend more of our time doing this, we then could take the next step into great action. But again, it's for everyone. I don't ever want somebody to think, well, I didn't do that, and therefore I've been wrong. Do what you can in the time that you have to dedicate to something like this. You know, I think people sometimes get so overwhelmed. They're like, I can't do it all, so I'm just not going to do anything. And for me, it's one small step that somebody else, you know, the analogy I always give for my students in terms of the impact that we make, you know, as educators who, you know, take it upon ourselves to go out there and constantly talk about Israel and bring up Israel in casual conversation. I say to them, you're never really going to know your impact. You know, what ultimately you need to think about is that with every person that you speak to, you're planting a seed. And that seed, it's not me going in and having to tell somebody the entire history of Israel. It's me going in and planting a little seed of maybe doubt that they think they knew what actually happened here, but they don't really know. And then my hope is always that another person, you know, who has more time or maybe is more active or, you know, just encounters this person later on, will then go on to water that seed. And each person contributes to watering that seed, eventually growing a person who really can then go on to be the activist. So we're in it together, I think, is a big message of we're a team and each one of us builds on each other's efforts. I do want to say, you know, I work for Stand With Us. I think Stand With Us does incredible work. And so I would say on the most basic level, if you can't donate your time, you can also always donate to the organization itself or to other organizations that are doing this work. Stand With Us just launched a Center for Combating Anti-Semitism, which the irony of ironies of so many people say to me, like, isn't that what you've always done? Like, haven't you guys always been combating anti-Semitism? And I think, yes, but we have always combated anti-Semitism that has manifested as anti-Zionism. And now what we're seeing is not just anti-Zionism, which, again, when I say that, we oftentimes say that anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, excuse me. And that's true about 99% of the time that it is. However, it's veiled anti-Semitism, right? It's calling Israel an apartheid state. It's treating Israel with a double standard, or, delegitimizing the existence of the state of Israel, this Jewish nation state. That's anti-Zionism. Today, in the last year, not in the last few years, we've seen actually a spike in anti-Semitism, outright anti-Semitism, not veiled anti-Semitism, just outright the drawing of swastikas, saying Jews control the world, Jews control the media. I mean, right now with the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen the reemergence of an ancient blood libel. I mean, of a middle-aged blood libel of the Jews are causing this, right? I mean, we're literally going back to 1347 and the Black Plague, and Jews being blamed for that as well. And here we are, same thing. And so we've also developed that. And again, that's the only way is we have to be out there raising awareness. And I think that's the easiest thing that people can do. And all it takes is having access to a cell phone, right? It's a matter of speaking out and sharing content on your social media. That's the easiest, most minimal thing that you can do to help in this fight. Again, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who works for an organization that is grassroots education. If you would speak to somebody who works with organizations that are more politically active, they would say what you said, Daphne, which is go out and, write to your congressman, write to your senator, write to your representative in the UK so that they know that their constituency is pro-Israel. And not just pro-Israel, but that they're supportive of the relationship with Israel, right? The UK-Israel relationship or the US-Israel relationship, and that relationship is mutually beneficial and important. So that's another level of going into the political activism sphere. There's the education activism sphere. And then the last one I would say is the media sphere, right? Which is not something that Stand With Us tackles. We will call out media bias, but there are organizations that are solely dedicated to doing that. The two would be honest reporting and camera. Those would be the two that I would really hyper focus in on. And so if you're someone who really likes to engage with the media, writing op-eds or writing letters to the editor, correcting, falsehoods that are in the media, that's another outlet. And if that's more your vibe, you could be doing that as well. And those organizations send out blasts basically saying, this happened, respond, make sure that this gets retracted, things like that. So there's a lot of different, depending on like your type of activism, there's so many things that you could do. And I guess the first step is just committing that you want to do it, committing that this is a cause that's important to you and that you want to stand up and fight for. And I think a lot of people find anti-Semitism as their cause because it starts with anti-Semitism, but it never ends with anti-Semitism.
No.
So you get to the core of the problem first and foremost when you tackle anti-Semitism. We always say it's like the canary in the mine, right? That when you start to see anti-Semitism in a society, you start to see the beginning of the erosion of that society. And that's what we've seen historically. And so, the director of our Center for Combating Anti-Semitism, she's not Jewish, but that's what she says. She says, I connect to this because this is an evil in our world and it's been around for thousands of years and we need to eradicate it. And I want to be a part of that.
So you've sparked off two or three things, and I didn't have these before the question was asked, but we have a podcast a couple of weeks ago with Brian Schrauger, who writes for the Jerusalem Post, and he addressed the issue of conspiracy theories and how the conspiracy theory will end up as anti-Semitic. So people listening to this might like to look up his podcast, which attacks it a slightly different angle, but was very, very good and very challenging. Another thing is, as you mentioned, the Quest for Truth documentary, there are a ton of facts and Charlotte appears on it a lot. So that is a resource you can have, that you can watch, that you can invite people to see, pass on the link. What is it? Quest for Truth, quest4truth.org.
But we can put Stand With Us website, and we could put the documentary website in the description.
So that is a very simple thing you can do. Now I'm going to take it into a whole different arena. I'm going to talk as a mother right now. it is too late to start getting your teenagers and your students on board. We're dragging them back. We've got to start in childhood. We have got to start then. And I will just give you a personal story, because people say, well, what would that look like? Because I was raised very much with my eye on Israel and what's happening there. And my girls were brought up, my older girls, tracking this. I can remember, now you might know the date, I don't know what it was, but when the Scuds fell on Israel, on Tel Aviv.
In 91. I don't know the exact date. I know that it was
right back then. So my Daniela, my youngest child, she was only about 4 or 5, something like that. Well, she was very young. And I can remember Andrew and Daniela coming to breakfast, and I told them that Scuds had fallen on Tel Aviv. And I gave them pen and paper, and they wrote letters. I mean, Daniela said, I am sorry your people got hurt. It was very childish. I went to what we had then, the telephone directory. I found a synagogue in Golders Green, and met them, found the address. No, I phoned up and said, can I have your address? And they, of course, they wanted to know why, and wanted to know I was Jewish, and said I wasn't. Anyway, we sent that letter there, and they put it in their synagogue magazine and wrote back. But you can start in childhood, creating that awareness and be an activist in childhood. It doesn't have to wait till teenage years, which makes your job harder. It can be raising our kids.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, your whole everything, generation to generation, right? That's the whole idea. You got to pass it on. And I do want to comment on this just very briefly, because there's a struggle today in the Jewish world. I got to tell you. You know, for a long time, it was very easy for parents to teach their children to be Zionists. It was just easy. It was, you know, we were a weak country. We were a country that was threatened constantly. And we were, and still, like what we now call the occupation, like our presence in the West Bank was still kind of, we were developing it, and the information about what was actually going on the ground was minimal. And so it was so easy to kind of teach Zionism and not feel like you're leaving things out. Now, I gotta stress, I was, you know, I'm an American. I was taught to be a patriot and, you know, to love the United States. And how I was taught that was I was taught the values of the United States, right? I was taught, why am I losing my words? In the Declaration, we talk about, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, these inalienable rights that we have. And that's what our country was founded on freedoms, right? On anyone can come here and live their life and be free and have religious freedom and you know, the freedom to speak out. And so I was raised in, you know, then you had this pride in the United States. And then, you know, as I became a teenager, it was like, okay, so now let's talk about what we did to the Native Americans, right? It was like, let's mention this. And that is the right way, as far as I'm concerned. Like, if they had taught me about slavery in its intensity and about, you know, what we did to the Native Americans and everything else right off the bat, I would have just hated the United States. And I wouldn't have been able to see the virtues of this country and what it's achieved in its 230 plus years. And it's the same with Israel. This country and what it's done in 72 years is something to be incredibly proud of. And something to have immense pride in, and to walk around with your head held high saying, yeah, I'm Jewish, and that's my country, and that represents me, and its values represent me. And for some reason, people today, young Jews today, find it so hard to teach that to their children because of the occupation. And I'm sitting there going, that doesn't erode our value. I mean, yes, you might argue that it's starting to erode our values, but then talk about the values first.
You want to talk about it because of it.
Exactly. And so it's, for me, it's a matter of parents realizing there's so much to be proud of. And just because you have a criticism here or a criticism there, doesn't mean that you can't instill an immense pride and love in Zionism in your children. And then, yes, don't hide it from them. Don't brainwash them. Once they're of an appropriate age, then dive more into complexity and into the things that Israel's done that's wrong, and frame it as, just like any other country, this is a country that has faltered and that has made mistakes. But it rests on a foundation of solid values that you could stand behind. And I feel that about the United States. I feel that about the United Kingdom. And again, these are places that have really sullied pasts. But again, they rest on a solid foundation of values that we strive for that maybe we don't always achieve. And so for me, you're 100% right. It starts in the home. And the easiest students that I encounter are those who are deeply Zionist. And now I find them in an age where they're struggling with that because they say, I love Israel, but what about this? And my response is, you can still love Israel even though they've made a mistake. And something that you think is wrong doesn't mean, and I'm part of that process, which is an incredible growth process, because when you support something, it should never be blind support, ever. It'll start that way as a kid, but it's not blind. You're supporting the values, right? And then as time goes on, I still support the values, but I don't support the actions necessarily. And that could just become a more complex opinion about something. I gave an analogy the other day. I've been filming Instagram stories where I'm answering people's questions on Instagram. By the way, you can always follow me at Charlotte Korchak on Instagram. And I've been doing these stories, and I gave this analogy of, supporting something doesn't mean that you're always going to just keep giving to that thing. If you're supporting a relative, I love my brother, let's say, but if my brother is addicted to heroin, the right proper support is not to keep giving him heroin. The right support system is to say, stop, you're doing something wrong. We need to correct this. That's part of support as well. And so teaching somebody to support Israel doesn't mean that you're then going to blindly support every action of Israel. It means that you're going to support Israel and you'll speak out on its behalf. And when it needs to be called out, you'll do so in the right place, right? In the right environment. And so I couldn't agree with you more. And you guys are doing such a good job around the world. You guys are doing this, instilling your values in the next generation. It's just, and it's crucial.
And you would do that for your brother because you love him.
Exactly.
Because you want what's best for him. You are able to challenge in a loving way to correct a behavior. And it should be the way it is, that from a loving place, we are able to then challenge and help correct.
Well, I would say too that I have raised my kids. They're now adults, of people who don't know, but it has been a part of our value system. It was a part of my parents' value system. Yeah. But that doesn't come. That has to be intentional, and activism starts young. And I would say, right in the middle of this, we have some of our closest friends are Muslims. Yeah. And that has been intentional too. So we're not talking about a polarization. We're not talking about love, hate, but personally and as an organization, we are passionate about support of Israel in whatever way it can be, of connecting with Israel, connecting with Jewish people, and the lifestyle. I think it needs to be a lifestyle, because the lifestyle is small things. I can remember what was one of the recent crises that was causing issues. I can't remember what it was. We were in London and I had a couple of teenagers with me. They were 13, 14, and there was a Jewish family, and it was very tense. Whether it was the election, I don't know. And intentionally, not because I necessarily wanted to do it for the Jewish people, but I wanted to model to these two youngsters what it looked like. And I went over to the Jewish family, and they looked horrified when they saw me coming. I mean, they looked horrified. They're Orthodox, so obviously I knew that they were. And I just went over and said, I just want to say to you, I'm going to cry. I just want to say to you, not everybody's against you. There are people like us who are for you. And you just saw the barriers come down, them just say thank you. Well, that was almost a byproduct of what I hoped. And they went back to the two young teenagers who were with me, and they said, what do you do? And I told them, and they went, oh. So it's about these small things that can make a big difference. And
I couldn't agree more. I mean, so I feel like I'm such a product of my upbringing, because here I was, a kid in Israel, right? 9, 10, 11 years old. And I witnessed my parents, they never saw Arab, Jew, Christian. Everyone was just a person. And my dad talks to everybody and becomes friends with everybody. And so here I was like a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, and I was going to Palestinian homes and going to Arab homes in East Jerusalem. And, we would have dinner together, and we would, there wasn't an us and them. It was just, this is just a family who we're friends with. And I also remember, though, the shock of all of my friends when, I think we had 2 or 3, we invited a few of them to my bat mitzvah. And Arab culture, you invite a few and they kind of bring their whole family. And so like a whole family showed up to my bat mitzvah, and all of my Jewish friends were almost terrified. what are they doing here? Who are these people? And I'm just like, these are friends of my family. And so when you say it's a lifestyle thing, to me, when I say a product of my upbringing, my parents, it was, you talk to everybody and you hear everything and you're politically active. I remember going to protests here in Israel when I was, 13 years old, 14 years old during the Second Intifada. And I remember going to, to the March for Women's Rights in DC, a million women walking, or a million people walking. And that was where my mom always like, let's go. We're going to go I remember protesting Bush's inauguration, the second Bush, in his second inauguration, because I was so liberal at the time. And so it really is, you're absolutely right. It's something that was instilled in me as a very young kid. And also I think it can go from political activism all the way through to education. I think I also had, my mother is like a walking encyclopedia. I mean, people say that about me, and you haven't seen anything until you've seen my mother. It's crazy. And she really instilled in me this, like, you don't have an opinion. You shouldn't have an opinion unless you know what you're talking about. Like, and she always instilled in me, like, seek knowledge, seek information, because that's power. And so 100% what you're saying, if you want these values to permeate throughout society, it starts in the home. And it starts through emulation, as you said. You know what they always say about really young kids who are, 2 years old, 3 years old? The one thing they'll do is they'll just copy everything you're doing, right? You know this as a mother. And so you lead by example, and you do it, and they'll emulate that. So you go to a protest, Mom, I want to come with you. And they see you at this rally, and they say, this is how we express ourselves. This is how we can non-violently and in a civil way express what we think. And so I couldn't agree more. And I kind of wanted to give mad props to my parents, because
I want to finish with saying something stronger than you have said. But just want to say, we cannot afford to ignore this. History tells us we cannot afford. We have personal responsibility. We have responsibility as society. We have responsibility as a nation. When we're voting for people, we need to find out what is their stand on support of Israel, and I'm talking about healthy support of Israel. What is their stand on defending and supporting Jewish people in the nation? And personally, history tells me we cannot ignore this issue for the sake of Israel, for the sake of Jewish people, and I would say for the sake of our own nations, because it will permeate every part of society, and history has proved that. So we're going to, as an organization and as raising the next generation, this is a huge part of the DNA we carry, and we will continue to carry. And meeting with you, Charlotte, and meeting with Stand With Us has just empowered us, I hope, to be more effective, and to carry the passion that is in our hearts more effectively.
Yeah, I think it's an appropriate place to stop with the generation to generation focus, and you honoring your parents.
And I want to say thank you to you guys, because to be honest, you say that we've inspired you, but your efforts, I mean, your story and what you've accomplished in your life, and especially where you've come from and how far you've gone, and really the dedication is something to be absolutely admired. And so it's really, really mutual. And I think I always say this when I'm there, I say this to you, I always feel like I'm part of the family. You've always made me feel part of the generation to generation family and part of your family personally. And I'm so appreciative of all the work that you do for the world generally, and then also obviously for Israel and for the Jewish people. So it goes without saying, but an amazing, just a great big thank you for all of your efforts, and thanks for having me, and thanks for embracing Stand With Us and me, and really bringing us together. So just so much thanks. Before
you make us cry, we want to thank you. We love you. We appreciate you coming. Hopefully we can have you back again, and we can dive into, a whole host of other issues. This is kind of a bottomless pit when you talk about Israel and the Jewish people. So thank you so much. We appreciate you and look forward to next time.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If it inspired you, please rate us and subscribe on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or another podcast platform.